Imagine being trapped deep in the mountains, surrounded by shadows that watch and whisper, where every step could lead to your last. 4 friends set out for a simple camping trip, but what they found was far darker, more terrifying than any nightmare. The forest itself seemed alive, hiding a horror older than time. What lurks beneath the earth's skin will break your mind and shatter your soul. Before we dive into their story, make sure to follow and support this channel for more chilling tales that haunt the night. Jake Miller wasn't the kind of guy who got scared easily. He spent most of his days under the hood of some half-finished machine, tinkering with gears and steel, solving problems no one else wanted to touch. So when he suggested a weekend camping trip in the Appalachians, nobody questioned him. It was supposed to be a quiet break from city noise. Just 4 people, 1 mountain, and a few nights under the stars. They left Asheville around noon, driving through winding back roads that grew narrower the higher they climbed. The sky was overcast, the air dry and cold. The kind of cold that sank into your sleeves without warning. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, cracking jokes and eating gas station jerky, while Rachel hummed along to the radio in the back seat, wrapped in a scarf. Sophie, Jake's sister, barely spoke. She sat quietly with her face turned toward the window, lost in her own world. When they finally reached the drop-off point, it was almost 4 p.m. The trailhead was marked by a rotting wooden post with faded red paint. A carved arrow pointed deeper into the trees. Just beneath it, barely visible, were the words burned into the wood. Red Hollow, camp at your own risk. Tyler read it out loud and laughed. That's gotta be part of the experience. Scared the city folks a little. Rachel chuckled but pulled her jacket tighter. Sophie didn't say a word. They hiked for almost an hour before reaching a flat clearing near a sloped ridge. It was tucked between 2 large pines, shielded from the wind. The perfect place to set up camp. Jake got the fire started while Tyler and Rachel struggled with their shared tent. Sophie walked the edge of the clearing, staring off into the dense tree line like she was trying to remember something. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the woods had gone silent. No birds, no wind, just the faint crackle of the fire. They sat around the flames, eating canned chili and telling half-true stories from college. Tyler broke out a bottle of whiskey, and for a while, everything felt normal. Until the footsteps started. Just past midnight, Jake stirred in his sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to embers. The cold had crept in. At first, he thought it was wind rustling the underbrush. But then he heard it again. Heavy, deliberate. Like someone pacing just outside the tent. He held his breath, waiting. The steps stopped. Then nothing. In the morning, he didn't mention it. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe he'd imagined it. But when he unzipped the tent and stepped out into the pale morning light, he noticed something odd. Near the fire pit, about 10 feet from where they slept, were footprints. Not theirs. Deep, wide prints, with a strange, worn tread pattern. Like boots. Old boots. Jake stood there silent. The forest around him still and quiet. Sophie walked up beside him, her voice flat. Someone was out here last night. Jake didn't answer. But he didn't look away from the prints either. The prints were already fading by the time the others saw them. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Tyler crouched beside the tracks, running his hand over the dirt. Not ours, he said. And not fresh either. These are from last night. Rachel glanced around, uneasy. There's nobody else up here, right? Jake shook his head. We didn't see any other cars. This trail isn't even marked on the new maps. They ate a quiet breakfast, then packed day bags for a short hike deeper into the woods. Jake wanted to explore the area, make sure they weren't camping near something unsafe. He didn't say it out loud, but the unease sat heavy in his chest. They followed a narrow, overgrown trail that veered north, past a stretch of dark spruce. An hour in, the trees opened to a rocky ridge, and down below, half hidden by thyme and brush, stood an old wooden structure. It looked like a hunting shack. Or what used to be one. The walls leaned inward like they were folding in on themselves. The roof sagged, one corner rotted out completely. A rusted lantern hung from the porch by a single nail, spinning gently in the breeze. "I don't like this," Rachel said under her breath. Jake stepped onto the creaking boards and pushed the door open. It groaned like something in pain. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Mold climbed the walls. Animal bones littered the corners. And in the far back, half buried under rotted blankets, was a shredded camping backpack. It had been torn open. Not ripped, not cut, shredded. The straps dangled like chewed ropes. A sleeping bag lay beside it, full of holes. Tyler poked around near the corner and found something else. A boot. Worn leather, old military style, with the same tread pattern Jake had seen near their tent. Jake looked back at the door. He had a sudden, overpowering urge to leave. Sophie hadn't entered the shack. She stood just outside, hugging her arms tightly. When Jake stepped out, she looked him in the eyes. "Someone else has been here," she said. "Recently." Tyler tried to shrug it off. "Probably just a hunter. Old stuff. Could have been abandoned years ago." But no one really believed that. That night, the forest felt different. Wrong. The firelight didn't stretch as far as it did before. Shadows clung tighter to the tree trunks. And when the wind died, the silence felt heavier than anything they'd heard. They all turned in early, curling into their sleeping bags without saying much. Jake was almost asleep when he heard it. A voice. Thin, distant, echoing through the trees. A child's voice. Laughing. At first, he thought it was the wind. But it came again, closer this time. A short, breathy laugh that didn't belong to anyone in their group. He sat up, heart pounding, and glanced around. Tyler stirred beside him but didn't wake. Jake listened, frozen. And then, in the silence, came the sound of a branch snapping. Right outside the tent. The morning came slowly, with a cold gray sky and a thick mist blanketing the ridge. Jake stepped out of the tent before the others were awake. The air was wet and heavy, the ground slick with dew. He stared into the trees where he thought he'd heard the laugh last night. Nothing moved. No birds. No wind. Just fog sliding through the branches like smoke. By the time everyone was up, the silence had worn thin. Rachel sipped instant coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Tyler tried to lighten the mood with a joke about ghost children, but no one laughed. Sophie sat on a log, staring into the fog, her face pale and unreadable. They decided to stay near the camp that day. No one said it out loud, but none of them wanted to wander too far. Sometime in the early afternoon, Sophie disappeared. Jake had been gathering firewood just down the hill. When he came back up, Sophie's seat was empty. Her jacket was gone. So was her bag. "Did she say where she was going?" Jake asked. Rachel looked worried. "No. I thought she was just over by the trees." They called her name until their voices cracked. The fog grew thicker. Sound didn't travel right. Sometimes Jake thought he heard her answer, but it came from different directions, and it never sounded quite right. After almost 2 hours, Sophie walked back into the clearing. Her hair was damp. Her face pale. She wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Where the hell were you?" Tyler snapped. "I got turned around," she said quietly. Jake stepped closer. "You okay?" She nodded once. Then sat back down on the log and didn't speak again for the rest of the night. They didn't press her. Not yet. That evening, the fog rolled in faster than before. It slid over the tents and turned the firelight into a dull orange glow. Jake stayed awake, sitting up near the fire long after the others turned in. Around midnight he heard Sophie's voice. She was muttering in her sleep, restless, turning over in her bag. He leaned closer. She whispered, almost too soft to hear. "He was watching me. In the trees. I saw him. I saw him standing there." Jake froze. She turned and fell silent. He didn't sleep at all. Just before dawn, he heard something again. A faint crunching of dead leaves, like footsteps circling the tents. He held his breath, his eyes wide, waiting to see movement beyond the fire pit. And then he saw it. A shape. Tall. Still. Just beyond the edge of the trees. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply stood there. Jake blinked. And it was gone. By morning, the fog was gone, but the tension lingered like smoke that wouldn't lift. No one spoke about the night. Not Sophie's whispers. Not the shape Jake had seen by the tree line. Rachel kept her eyes on the ground. Tyler moved like he was in a daze, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Jake couldn't take it anymore. "We need to leave," he said, packing up the cooking gear. "Something's not right out here." Sophie didn't argue. That scared him more than if she had. They started breaking down camp, but just as Jake began folding his tent, Sophie froze mid-motion. Her eyes were fixed on something in the dirt. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jake stopped. "Hear what?" They all went still. At first, it was faint. A low, humming vibration, like a distant engine. But it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from beneath them. Rachel knelt and pressed her palm against the earth. Her eyes widened. "It's under us." Then the ground trembled. Just for a second. It wasn't an earthquake. It was more focused, like something deep below had stirred and rolled over, pressing against the surface of the earth. Everyone stepped back. Jake's instincts kicked in. "We're out of here," he said. But when they turned toward the trail, the path was gone. The underbrush had shifted. The trees looked different. What had been a narrow path downhill now looked like untouched forest. No trampled grass. No broken twigs. Nothing. Tyler cursed. "This doesn't make sense. We came from that direction." Jake tried to pull up the GPS on his phone, but there was no signal. No bars. Just static and a flickering location dot that spun in place. "Let's go down the slope anyway," Rachel said. "We'll hit a road eventually." They pushed downhill, but the woods fought back. Every few feet, thick brambles forced them to change direction. The forest grew darker, thicker, the trees suddenly too close together. It felt like they weren't moving forward at all. They stopped to rest near a moss-covered boulder. The air was damp, smelling of iron and rotting wood. That's when Sophie pointed to the rock. Carved into the stone, almost hidden beneath the moss, was the same faded text from the trailhead's sign. "Red Hollow, camp at your own risk." Tyler stepped back. "No way. That's not possible. We hiked away from that spot." Jake stared at the carving, his stomach turning. It was the same boulder from their camp. They had been walking in a circle. Rachel started crying softly. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the forest. Everyone snapped toward the sound. It came again. Closer. A heavy, deliberate dragging. Like chains on rock. Something was moving. Not around them. Beneath them. They didn't speak. No one dared. The sound was still echoing, deep and heavy, somewhere below the forest floor. It faded slowly, like something massive had passed through an underground corridor. Sophie stood completely still, her breath shallow. "It's not an animal." Rachel clung to Tyler's arm, trembling. Jake scanned the trees, every branch and shadow looking wrong, twisted. "We have to get higher," he said. "There's a ridge up that way. If we can get a view, maybe we'll spot a road or some lights." No one argued. The climb was steep. Wet moss covered the rocks and roots, and the forest grew more unnatural with each step. Tree trunks warped in odd spirals. Branches curved downward, forming almost a cage above them. The air grew colder as they climbed. When they reached the top, they were surrounded by dead silence. No wind. No birds. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. Then Jake saw it. Just beyond the ridge, nestled in the trees, was a structure. It looked like a church, but wrong. A narrow steeple bent at an angle, the roof patched in with mismatched wood. The windows were black, sunken. Moss grew in thick veins down the front steps. Rachel shook her head. That wasn't here before, Sophie whispered. It's been here a long time. They didn't want to go near it. But the sun was falling fast behind the mountain, and there was nowhere else to go. Jake led the way. The steps groaned under their feet as they approached. The door, tall and narrow, opened without a touch. Inside, the air was dry. Dust danced in the fading light from the doorway. Wooden pews lined both sides, crooked and rotting. At the far end, where the altar should have been, was a large pit, a black hole dug into the floor, surrounded by faded markings. Sophie didn't move. I've seen this before. Tyler turned. What? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the pit. Jake stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Don't. I've seen it, she repeated. In dreams. For weeks. The markings around the hole were old, carved deep into the wood. Shapes Jake didn't recognize. Symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then the whispering started. At first, it sounded like leaves rustling outside. Then it grew sharper, like voices. Many voices. All speaking at once, from every direction, but never loud enough to understand. Rachel covered her ears. Make it stop. Please make it stop. Jake backed away from the pit, pulling Sophie with him. And that's when Tyler screamed. He had turned toward the entrance. His eyes wide. Mouth open. Pointing. Outside the church, lining the edge of the trees, were figures. Dozens of them. Standing perfectly still. Motionless silhouettes. Tall. Thin. Silent. Watching. Then, all at once, they began to step forward. Jake grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her away from the pit. Sophie was already backing toward the nearest wall, her eyes locked on the dark figures advancing through the trees. Move! Jake shouted. Out the back! They burst through a door behind the altar that led into a narrow hallway. The air was thick with dust and mold. Old wooden beams creaked above them as they ran, the whispers growing louder, pressing against their minds like fingers clawing at the inside of their skulls. The hallway led to a collapsed stairwell. They scrambled down the broken boards into the undercroft, a stone chamber beneath the church. The space was cold, ancient, the walls covered in more of the same carved symbols. Rachel was sobbing now. Why is this happening? No one answered. Jake moved fast, sweeping his flashlight across the stone, looking for any way out. The whispers continued, but now they had shape, like something was forming in the dark corners of the room. Then Jake found it. A crawl space. Low, narrow, and leading into total blackness. We don't have a choice, he said. Go! Tyler went first, crawling on hands and knees. Then Rachel. Then Sophie. Jake came last, constantly checking behind them. Every time he looked back, it felt like the space behind them had changed. Like the walls were breathing. The crawl space opened into a tunnel. Dirt walls. Cracked stone. It stank of iron and wet soil. They were underground now, somewhere far from where they started. They followed the tunnel in silence, the only sound their breathing and the occasional groan of shifting earth. After what felt like forever, the tunnel began to slope upward. A faint glow appeared ahead, pale daylight leaking through an opening. They climbed toward it and emerged into the forest again. But it wasn't the same forest. The trees were wrong. Taller. Gnarled. Bark like burned skin. And the sky overhead was dim, even though the sun should have been rising. Sophie stepped out first. Her eyes scanned the twisted landscape. We're not in the same place, she said. Rachel looked around. But we didn't go that far. No, Jake cut in, voice low. It brought us somewhere else. They kept walking. The forest was silent except for their footsteps and the occasional crack of dead branches underfoot. Then, far behind them, came the sound of movement. Slow. Steady. Following. They started running again. The woods bent around them. No direction felt right. Trees began to close in from all sides. And behind them, just barely visible through the underbrush, the shadows moved. Tall. Unblinking. Closer. They didn't speak. They didn't stop. Jake's lungs burned. Rachel stumbled and nearly fell, but Tyler caught her. Sophie's eyes were wide and unblinking, focused dead ahead. Suddenly, a clearing opened. Dead center stood a rusted fire tower, its ladder climbing into the mist above. Jake didn't hesitate. Up! One by one they climbed. The metal groaned with every step. Rust flaked under their hands. The forest below twisted and pulsed, the shapes gathering at the base. By the time they reached the top, the woods were full of them. Watching. Waiting. And not one of them made a sound. The platform at the top of the fire tower swayed gently in the cold wind. It was barely large enough for all four of them. The railing was rusted through in places, and the wood beneath their feet creaked with every shift of weight. From up there, they could see the entire forest, or what was supposed to be the forest. But it had changed. What surrounded them now was a twisted sea of black trees, reaching toward the sky like claws. The shadows below moved in slow, unnatural rhythms, and the figures, those same tall shapes, stood scattered among the trunks. Always facing the tower. Always still. Tyler slumped to the floor of the platform, shaking. What is this place? Jake didn't answer. He scanned the horizon, desperate to find something familiar. A road. A trail. A light. But there was nothing but forest. Endless and wrong. Sophie stood at the edge, gripping the railing. They're waiting for something, she said. Rachel hugged herself, rocking slightly. What do they want from us? But again, no one had an answer. The wind shifted. The air smelled of rust and rot. Then came the sound again. From beneath the forest floor. A deep, groaning vibration. Like something enormous turning over in its sleep. It rattled the tower, made the metal whine. And this time, it was louder than before. Closer. Jake gripped the side of the structure, trying to stay steady. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then Sophie said something that made his blood run cold. They're not the real danger. He turned to her. What? They're watching us, she said, eyes still fixed on the forest below. But they're not what's hunting us. Before he could speak, the wind shifted again, and a horrible sound came up from the woods. Not the low groan they'd been hearing. This was sharper. Wetter. Like something tearing open. And then one of the figures moved. It didn't walk. It folded. Collapsed inward like paper, limbs snapping in unnatural directions, crumpling into the earth. Rachel screamed. More followed. One by one, the figures dropped. No noise, no struggle, just folding down into nothing, like they'd never been real. And from the center of the forest, where the first had fallen, something else was rising. Not walking. Not running. Rising. A shape that didn't follow any natural form. Towering. Shifting. A mass of limbs and eyes and mouths that opened too wide and didn't close. It pulsed as it moved forward, not on legs, but pulled by something unseen. Sophie backed away from the railing. They're afraid of it, she whispered. The tower groaned again, the metal supports shrieking. Jake looked down and saw the base of the tower start to twist. Wood and metal warping like clay. The structure was being pulled downward, into the forest. We have to get off this thing, he yelled. But it was already too late. The tower was sinking. Slowly. Unevenly. Like it was being consumed by the ground itself. And the thing in the woods kept coming. The tower tilted with a sickening lurch, the top platform groaning under the strain. Jake grabbed the railing to stay upright, but it bent in his hands like soft wire. Rusted bolts shot loose, falling into the shifting dark below. It's pulling us down! Tyler shouted. No one hesitated. One by one, they scrambled back onto the ladder, the whole tower vibrating as if it were being chewed alive. The climb down felt endless, the sky above them warping, the shadows on the forest floor reaching upward. Jake was last. He looked back just once, and regretted it instantly. The creature was no longer at a distance. It was moving through the trees like a fluid shadow, its shape changing constantly. Long arms reached out and slid between branches like smoke. Its many eyes rolled in place, unblinking, and its mouth hung open, gaping but silent. There was no logic to it. No face to scream at. No body to aim at. It was like it had been born from the forest itself, something older than the mountains, something that had waited in the dirt for too long. The second Jake's boots hit the ground, they ran. This time, they didn't choose a direction. They just ran until the air burned their lungs and their legs nearly gave out. They didn't look back. They couldn't. The trees thinned, just enough to reveal a narrow split in the mountainside, a jagged opening barely wide enough for a person. Rachel spotted it first. In there! They ducked into the crevice, squeezing through the rock, scraping shoulders and knuckles on the rough stone. Inside, it opened into a cave. Cold. Pitch black. Jake flicked on his flashlight. The beam stretched out over damp stone walls, and to their surprise, dry footprints. Human ones. Sophie reached down and touched the prints. Someone's been here recently. They followed the trail deeper into the cave, away from the nightmare behind them. The creature's distant movements echoed outside, crunching trees, dragging sounds, but it didn't enter. Not yet. Further in, they found remnants of a small campsite. A rusted lantern. An old sleeping bag. A journal, soaked and warped from years of damp air. Jake picked it up and peeled back a page. The writing was shaky, barely legible, but it was in English. Trapped. Followed. It doesn't kill you right away. It waits. The longer you stay, the more it remembers you. I don't know what it is. But the mountain feeds it. Rachel backed away. It's happened before. Sophie was reading over his shoulder. Red Hollow. She pointed at the bottom of the page, where the name had been scratched in with force. Over and over. Nearly tearing through the paper. Tyler's voice cracked. We're not getting out of here, are we? No one answered. Then came a sound none of them expected. A voice. From the back of the cave. A whisper. So faint they barely caught it. Help me! They froze. Rachel turned, flashlight shaking in her hands. Who's there? The voice came again. Louder. Desperate. Please help! And then, slowly, from the shadows at the back of the cave, something began to crawl into the light. It looked like a man. But it wasn't. The figure dragged itself slowly from the shadows, one elbow at a time. Its face was thin, hollowed by time. Skin stretched tight over bones. Hair matted with dirt and blood. Clothes torn and fused to the body, as if they'd rotted into the flesh. Jake stepped in front of the others instinctively. Stay back. The figure's eyes flicked up at them. Alive. Barely. It opened its mouth to speak, but only a ragged breath came out. Then, it lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the cave wall. Etched into the stone behind it was a single sentence, scratched and with some sharp object over and over again. I should not have looked back. Sophie crouched slowly. Who are you? The figure's lips moved. It sounded like it was trying to speak, but no words formed. Jake stepped closer, just enough to get a better look. And then he saw the brand on the man's arm. A deep, blackened mark. Burned into the skin. The same symbol from the church altar. Rachel gasped. He was marked. The man's eyes widened at the word. Then, in a sudden burst of energy, he grabbed Jake's wrist. His voice came out as a wheeze. You brought it with you. Jake yanked his hand back, heart slamming in his chest. What do you mean? The man collapsed again, eyes fluttering. You don't leave Red Hollow. You spread it. And then, he stopped breathing. The cave fell into silence, thick and absolute. A low rumble echoed from deep within the mountain. Like the growl of something waking up from a long sleep. Sophie stood slowly. He was one of them. Tyler stared at the body. What's them? Jake didn't answer. His eyes were locked on something behind the dead man. On the stone wall. More symbols. Carved deeper. Older. The kind that made your eyes ache if you looked too long. And below them, another path. A tunnel. No footprints this time. Just a single, long drag mark in the dirt. As if someone, or something, had been pulled down. The wind outside shifted again. This time it didn't feel cold. It felt wet. Like breath. Rachel clutched her chest. It's here. No one needed to say anything. They started down the tunnel. Whatever was happening to the forest, to the air, to the sky, it was spreading. The darkness behind them wasn't staying put. It was alive, and it was following. The path twisted and turned until the walls grew tighter, the ceiling lower. The drag mark never stopped. It went on and on, deeper underground, into the belly of the mountain. Then they heard it again. That same voice. But this time, it was different. Not pleading. Not human. Just mimicking. Help me! It echoed off the stone. Again. Help me! Rachel turned pale. That's his voice. The dead man's voice, now being repeated by something else. Jake raised the flashlight and aimed it forward. At the end of the tunnel, the drag mark stopped. And the stone gave way to something else entirely. A vast underground chamber. Too large to be natural. Walls covered in carvings. Bones embedded in the dirt. And in the center, pulsing like a living organ, was something huge. Black. Breathing. It knew they were there. And it had waited a long, long time. The chamber was colder than anything they'd felt before. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, decay, fear, and something alive. Jake shined his flashlight on the pulsating mass at the center. It wasn't solid. It moved like a shadow caught in a slow heartbeat. Black veins throbbed beneath its surface, stretching and retracting in unnatural rhythms. It's the mountain's heart, Sophie whispered. What's been feeding all of this? The walls around them seemed to pulse too, the carvings shifting like living things. Faces appeared and vanished, twisted screams frozen in stone. A low growl rumbled from the dark, surrounding them. Tyler gripped Jake's arm. We need to get out of here. No, Jake said, voice steady but cold. We have to stop it. How? Rachel asked, voice barely a whisper. Jake looked down at the journal he still held. The last page was soaked but readable. The heart can be killed. But its pain is your pain. If you try to destroy it, it will reach inside you and tear you apart. He swallowed hard, fear digging deep, but also something else, determination. We don't have a choice, he said. They moved closer to the heart. Sophie took a deep breath and touched the pulsing mass. Her eyes rolled back for a moment. She gasped, shaking violently, like the thing was reaching into her mind. Then she collapsed. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. We have to be strong, he said, looking at Rachel and Tyler. Rachel nodded, tears running down her face. Together, they pressed their hands to the shadowy mass. It burned like ice. The chamber shook violently. The heart pulsed faster, screaming without a sound. Suddenly, the carvings on the walls exploded outward, shards of stone cutting through the air. Jake felt something inside him rip. Pain. Memories. Fears. Every dark thing he'd ever tried to forget, flooding his mind. But he held on. The shadow mass started to crack. Light spilled out from the fissures. The growling stopped. The chamber began to collapse. Run! Jake yelled. They sprinted toward the tunnel. Rocks fell around them. The ground shook. The mountain itself seemed to scream. Outside, the forest was quiet again. The sky brightened. The strange trees faded into normal pines. The sun rose fully. They were alive. But none of them ever spoke of what had happened in the mountains again. Because some things are best left buried.